Did you know that the Bible mentions God having a body? This is relevant to the question of why does God need our worship, or does God need our worship? Because I think that answer is a little bit different if your God is physically with you. I'm Brianna, I'm a life coach, and I am here to support you in your religious deconstruction and your connection to God. Today we're talking about why does God need our worship? And this is video 2 in a mini series of 3 videos that will culminate in me discussing how we can reimagine our relationships with God. I wanted to have these 2 conversations before that one to set the context. So the question is, does God need our worship? Let's start by talking about God having a body. In 2023, Francesca Stavrakopoulou published a book called God in Anatomy, and it's about God's body. And she's going through all the references of God's body, to Yahweh's body, as well as the cultural ideas or claims about the gods being physically present. I did at one point Google what did Yahweh's body look like, or what does God's body look like, and I got that it was like a human but gigantic. So if we think about it this way, it to me makes more sense that people would worship these gods because they were physically there, providing things like protection, blessings, favor, prosperity. You know, they're literally worshiping and making sacrifices to this physical God. That makes sense. But at some point, God became hidden, and now we're at a point where God is completely hidden, or Yahweh at least is totally hidden from us. We're not having the same exchanges as people did, or people reportedly did, in the Old Testament. As far as God having a body, the references that you are familiar with are God walking through the garden with Adam and Eve, and God wrestling with Jacob. I recently saw, I think it was Psalm 87, Yahweh fighting the Leviathan. So there are references to God's body. Christians have obfuscated these references to be metaphorical, but what if they weren't? I don't know if they were or not. In the last video, I posed the question, was mythology meant to be real? It's easy for me to believe that we did start off with these gods ruling us and living amongst us. And maybe the gods were some sort of aliens. Maybe just like that. I can believe that, but I don't know. So I don't know if they were. There are lots of accounts of gods having physical bodies, and even artifacts. In the book, Francesca talks about how she stood in the footprint of what's meant to be a god, and it was massive. So yeah, I mean, I can't say they were or were not there, but just as much as anything else, there are references to God having been physical at some point and then becoming hidden, and now totally hidden. People say that they're having a relationship with God, or especially Jesus, but I don't think that it's the same as what people were talking about even in the Old Testament. So if God no longer has a body, to me, worship no longer makes sense. And the reason I thought about this is because I had this conversation with the lady from the library I mentioned a couple videos ago. There's a lady I met at the library, and she went on to evangelize me for a while. The last conversation we had on the phone, I was just trying to, talk about some things. And one of the things I said was, I don't understand why God needs our worship. She didn't have an answer, of course, but that did set me off on a journey of ultimately contemplating who or what I believe God to be. But I researched, why does God need our worship? And I never came up with an answer, but people gave answers. Like, I never got any biblical a real biblical answer for why God needed our worship, but people gave very authoritative answers. And the answers were one of these three things. God deserves our worship. So that's why he's commanding it, because he deserves it. And the second one would be worship is reflexive. Like, if you're really experiencing God, then you should be worshiping God. And I'm sure you've heard this if you grew up like in a, I don't know. If you grew up in church, you probably heard worship is a response to what we see. And then the third one being, we're the ones that need to worship God. And that one I actually can see. I think it is useful to us to have a posture of not being at the top, like understanding that there is a greater power above us and having a heart of gratitude to that. I can see that, but none of those are biblical answers. So there is no real biblical answer for why we have to worship God. However, in the midst of this search, I did find a random comment that made it all make sense to me. The comment, obviously I can't locate it, is deep in my screenshots, and you know, screenshots, especially screenshots of YouTube comments, are like, they all look the same. But the comment said something to the effect of, gods needed to be worshipped so that they would exist. And if that's not the most rational thing that I have ever heard, I don't know what is. Because if you think about it, if you put yourself back in the context of the Israelites, and they're, you know, trying to get their God to take care of them, then they have to worship their God. If they don't worship their God, then that God no longer has any influence. So he's really not a God anymore, like he loses his esteem. Even more so, the comment indicated like in life and death, like that people need to believe in the God for the God to continue to exist. Now, God is totally hidden. Yahweh is totally hidden from us at this point, yet we continue to worship Yahweh. And Yahweh is so powerful and omnipresent. He's usurped any idea of God, so that whenever someone in America talks about God, it is assumed they mean Yahweh, even though that's not necessarily the case. And Christians often cannot even conceive of the idea that God, a creator energy, could be anything other than Yahweh. So yeah, worship definitely does work that way in sustaining the life and the power of the entity in life and death. So to me, worship is literally for the God, so that the God can live and rule. And I feel that even though I don't think the relationships that we as a people have with God today is the same as the people in the Old Testament, this version of God, or this construct of God, it is still omnipotent, because it still is given credit for so much that happens. The idea of God is as omnipotent as an actual God. So I say all that to say that worship is a religious concept, meaning there is an actual function to worship. It gives your God power. It sustains the power from the God, of the God, as well as sort of like makes a plea for the benefits from the God. So when you're outside of the context of a religion, which has an assigned God, then you don't just have to worship. I'm saying this because so many Christians cannot understand that just because you don't worship their God, you don't worship Yahweh, that doesn't mean you are worshiping something else or yourself. You've heard it so many times that people are making themselves gods. Well, no, because I don't have to have a God. I don't have to subjugate myself to an entity and make that known every chance I get. That is a religious concept. So I just think that that's important to say, because when you remove the need to worship your God, your relationship with God can be a lot of different things. And that's what we'll get into in the next video. I hope you liked this video. Please leave me a comment and a like. Unlike an actual God, I am a human and I do need an external validation. So please comment, let me know what you think about this idea. You can correct me if you need to, but I wasn't really giving facts, so I don't know what you could really correct me on. But at any rate, I do appreciate any education, and please subscribe if you want more content and if you want to see the third video in this little mini series. I will see you in the next one.